We're continuing with the Eightfold Path, and we're going to bring in one of the spokes on the wheel so that, in the sense, there's the idea that we want the wheel to run smoothly rather than wobbly. So we're going a little bit in depth to each spoke. And this one is called right intention, or resolve, or aspiration, or imagination. There's a few translations.
There's this teaching that's called the Dhammapada, and it's a later teaching. It's part of early Buddhism, but it's a later early Buddhism teaching. And it's called it's commentary, and it comes from a variety of translators. So, but the line that we're going to really address is the mind is the forerunner of all things. Put into other words, everything you experience, everything you do is first shaped by the mind.
And in typical reflective meditation practice, we're going to question that. That how can you really know what's first? Isn't it really what you're first aware of? And you can't be aware of everything, and there's no idea that we should be able to be aware of all of our bodily experience or thoughts and emotions.
And that's a real misunderstanding for people who are new or newish to reflective meditation, because people often talk about what's going on in their mind, right? Where it's interesting because more what I learned in Vipassana is more along the lines of the mind is the forerunner of all things. And yet we're being more aware of the mind, but we're really not saying it is the forerunner of all things. That's not our view.
Yeah, it's an interesting, actually, somewhat of a contradiction to put it as the forerunner, but then really pay more attention to the body, or give that precedence.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Part of what we're looking at with this is how we language and talk about our experience, how we're aware of it, our reactivity. And I'm gonna interview Nelly a little bit about some reactivity and try to untangle the way we're looking at the mind and body and how they come together.
So last week I got I shouldn't open my emails before I go to bed, but I did this particular evening, and it was a mistake because there was a very disturbing email, and it's about I'm trying to transfer the building of Pine Street Sangha, and I thought we had everything. The sales agreement was all, we were ready to roll. We just had to, go to escrow and just finish this thing up finally. It's been going on since May with this person, this organization, excuse me. And then I got an email last week saying, oh, well, maybe they wouldn't sign the sales agreement for this and that reason, which like it just spun me right out. So there I was in bed, feeling so, my body was like, felt really awful, really my nervous system was whacked out. And I was, having what one might call obsessive thoughts, like, how could this be happening? Like, and trying to figure out how it could be happening, which, by the way, I actually did figure out what was causing it to happen that way. However, I didn't know that it was different, and I was really upset.
So at that point, Nellie, I mean, it probably wasn't even on your radar to think which comes first, my mind or body. They just
Oh,
kind of.
it was not. But after the fact, when we started to write this Dharma talk, it's like, oh, well, it seemed like they were both there. The thinking, I couldn't separate the thinking from my nervous system being whacked out. And by the way, I knew that because there was no way I was going to fall asleep. I was too revved up.
Hmm. Hmm. So in some ways, you had to tolerate that a bit before you could even reflect upon it.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, really, and I realized, and it's funny because just we often talk right before we give these Dharma talks to sort of, or these conversations to get a little clear about what we want to talk about. And it wasn't until then, like whatever, 15 minutes ago, that I realized, oh, what actually started to shift things was when I became aware that this reaction was bigger than what met the situation. They
Mhm.
weren't in sync.
Yeah.
It was too big.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not a conscious intention to find that. I mean, what you're going to find, that was kind of surprising, or that I think what was surprising about it was that you did find something more in this, more conditions about them coming together.
Well, I wouldn't actually say it that way, Linda. What was more surprising was the relief that came
Mm.
and how my thoughts and my nervous system calmed down
Mm.
when I could sort of zoom out and see a bigger picture.
Mm.
Now, the bigger picture that I got to that night is that, it hooked into childhood trauma. My family had a lot of money trauma and I just got this. This is sort of interesting because it goes to anatta and self. I never got this, but until now. But also, my mother said my father was, too trustful of people, and that's why he went bankrupt, and we had a family, financial trauma. And she said, you're too trustworthy, just like your father. So
Mm.
I realized it was really actually a self view
Mm.
that was causing the reactivity. I was feeling really bad about myself because I had trusted this. And then I got this email that said, this is not trust, something untrustworthy is going on. And that really
Mm.
spun me out.
Mm.
But obviously that's not all of who I am, and I'm not
Right.
always and who knows what's too trustworthy or not too
Right.
trustworthy.
Right. Right. So the view really couldn't hold in this situation.
Well, it was understanding that it came from childhood that and that yeah, it didn't hold, right,
Didn't
Linda?
hold. But knowing where it went, where it came from, could you say that that led it to drop to the relief? I mean, this is kind of I'm trying to get at, like, when we try to think, say one thing happened and then another thing came as the result of that, rather than maybe that was a part of a whole complex of things that you weren't so aware of, but you were aware of the childhood trauma, and then this dropped. The relief. I'm sorry, I'm getting you confused. I can see.
Yeah, I'm confused. True. You saw that confused look upon my face.
Yes, yes. And when we see confusion, we step back a little bit, give some more room to fill this out.
Well,
Yeah.
let's go, Linda, to what we were talking about earlier, that this wasn't so intentional because we're talking
Yeah.
about skillful or appropriate intention. It wasn't consciously intentional, but it is very trained in me to be aware of when experience seems bigger than the current situations warrant. And then, and this is probably we're all too conditioned to this to some extent, to think things started or habits started as a thing in childhood and to sort of go back there. But what's maybe most important is that, well, I don't know what's most important, but it took me off of it took me off of that intensity in the moment
Right.
in this situation.
Right.
There was more there.
Yeah. Yeah. And we talk about that in the Dharma as something dropping or ceasing, that, you're in a different actually mind state, body state, right? Both.
Definitely, definitely, yeah. And something did drop. Now, it's not to say that if I got another email, that said the deal was compromised or possibly off, I promise you I'd be reactive again. So
Yeah.
it's not complete cessation.
Well, and that's the interesting thing about, the Dharma teaching of conditionality, is that things arise together and differently at different times. So the idea that we'd even been looking for the foremost or the complete end feels a little bit off the track. It's more about what else is there. How is it affecting me? Where does this lead?
And one last thing I do need to say, even though it might be a bit off topic, is that not all reactivity is bad. Sometimes reactivity, I mean, there was something that was really amiss about what was going on in this email. So, like in my glossary, I value reactivity as a piece of wisdom telling us something.
Thank you, Nellie.
Yeah. So I'm pretty certain it's my turn to ring the bell this morning.
I'm